Abigail's life, a constant reminder of the emptiness that stretched both inside and out. It coated the sills of the silent house, muted the color of the worn dress she wore like a second skin, and settled in the lines around her eyes, lines carved not by laughter but by a sun that gave no quarter and a grief that had long since forgotten the mercy of tears. Her ranch was an island in a sea of hardpan and sagebrush, a testament to a resilience she was no longer sure she possessed. Each day, she moved through the motions of survival, her heart a quiet, shuttered room where memories of her husband, Jacob, were kept under lock and key. The desert wind carried whispers of loneliness, and the vast, unblinking sky was a witness to her solitude. She often thought she was too old for this life, too weary for the fight. And then, as if the sky itself had decided to break its long silence, a change began to brew on the horizon. A bruise of purple and grey clouds gathered, promising a violence the parched land craved. It was in the tense, electric air before the storm that she saw him, a dark shape against the fence line, a man who collapsed as if his strings had been cut by God himself. He was a piece of the coming storm, an unknown, a danger. A flicker of her old self, the one that ran the ranch with Jacob, rose up, cautious, wary. But it was a weary voice in her mind that spoke the loudest, a tired whisper against the rising wind. "I'm too old for this kind of trouble." The thought was as dry and brittle as a dead leaf, a prayer for the peace he would surely shatter. She hesitated only a moment, her hand on the rough wood of the porch railing, before a resolve harder than the land itself settled in her bones, and she moved toward the fallen man, walking directly into the heart of the storm she didn't know had already begun. He was heavier than he looked, a dead weight of muscle and bone that tested the strength in her arms and back. She dragged him across the thirsty ground, the effort a grunt in the heavy air, her focus narrowed to the single, practical task. Get him inside. Out of the coming rain. Away from whatever followed him. In the dim light of her cabin, he was a map of a hard life. As she cut away his torn shirt, lamplight caught the geography of his skin. An old scar, a silvered crescent, curved over his ribs like a new moon. Others traced paths through the sun-darkened skin. But the wound that had brought him down was fresh, a raw, angry gash along his side where a bullet had kissed flesh. It wasn't deep, but it had taken its price in blood. She worked with an efficiency born of long practice, her movements clean and sure as she cleaned the wound and bound it tightly with strips of clean linen. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow, his face a mask of exhaustion. She saw the lines of pain etched around his mouth, the weary set of his jaw. He was no younger than her, perhaps older, a man who had seen too much of the world's rough edges. When he finally woke, the storm had broken, and rain lashed against the windows. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, found hers. They held no surprise, only a deep, bottomless weariness. "Water," he rasped, his voice rough as sandpaper. She brought it without a word. Her questions were terse. "Who are you?" He watched her for a long moment before answering. "Cormac, just the name. Nothing more." "Who did this?" His gaze flickered to the window, to the darkness outside. The past his answers were stones dropped into a deep well, and Abigail knew better than to listen for the splash. She felt the delicate balance of her solitude shift. The cabin was no longer just empty, it was now filled with a dangerous, unspoken tension, a presence that was both a threat and, to a part of her she had long thought buried, a strange, unwelcome comfort. The storm passed, leaving the air clean and the world reborn in vivid color. Cormac stayed. He didn't ask, he simply began to exist within the rhythm of her life. By the second day, he was on his feet, his movement stiff but deliberate. He found the woodpile and the axe, and the steady, rhythmic thud of splitting logs became a new sound in her quiet world, a sound of purpose. He mended the section of fence where he had fallen, his large, calloused hands working with a practiced ease that spoke of a life spent with his hands. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who doesn't waste energy, a man who knows the cost of every motion. Abigail watched him from the kitchen window, her hand still in the dishwater, a strange feeling coiling in her gut. She had been alone for so long, the master of her own small, quiet kingdom. Now there was another presence, a silent, capable man who anticipated needs she hadn't even voiced. He never spoke unless she spoke first, but a new language was growing between them, one built of shared glances across the dinner table, of the way he'd leave a bucket of fresh water by the door, of the brief, accidental brush of their hands as she passed him a plate. Each small act was a thread, weaving them into a delicate, unspoken tapestry. The question returned to her again and again, a persistent hum beneath the surface of her days. Am I too old for a second chance? The thought felt foolish, the fantasy of a younger woman. Her life was set, her path worn smooth by routine and resignation. We all build fences around our hearts, some out of wood and wire, others out of grief and fear. Tell me in the comments, what does it take for you to let someone in? Cormac was a breach in her fence, a wild element in her carefully controlled world, and every time she looked at him, she felt the foundations of her solitude begin to tremble. Another storm rolled in a week later, a real gully washer that turned the dusty yard into a sea of red mud and trapped them inside the small cabin. The world shrank to the four walls of the room, the drumming of rain on the tin roof, and the warm glow of the kerosene lamp. The silence that fell between them that night was different. It wasn't the tense quiet of two strangers, nor the empty quiet of solitude. It was a comfortable wait, a shared space. She'd made a stew, and the rich smell filled the air, a scent of home she hadn't realized she missed. He ate with a focus that suggested he'd known real hunger, his gaze fixed on his bowl. Then, he looked up, the lamplight carving deep shadows into the planes of his face, and he spoke. I was a different man, once, he said, his voice low, the words seeming to cost him something. Before the war. Before. Everything after he offered no more, but it was the first crack in his stoic facade, a glimpse of the man beneath the scars. The confession, small as it was, seemed to invite one of her own. She found herself speaking a name she hadn't said aloud to another soul in 5 years. Jacob, my husband. He built this place. Every board. Said it was our fortress against the world. She traced a knot in the wooden table with her finger. Turns out the world finds its way in, no matter how strong the walls. Cormac didn't offer platitudes or empty comforts. He just listened, his stormy eyes holding hers, and in his gaze she saw a deep, profound understanding. He wasn't just hearing her words, he was hearing the silence around them, the years of unspoken grief. In that moment, he truly saw her, not as a widow, not as a rancher, but as a woman who had also known her before and after the rain beat down, a relentless rhythm, washing the world clean while something old and stained inside the cabin was just beginning to surface. The storm outside was a physical manifestation of the tempest inside her. The air in the cabin was thick, charged with unspoken words and the raw, dangerous energy of two lonely souls colliding. Abigail felt brittle, her composure stretched thin as old glass. She stood to clear the plates, her movements jerky, and the worn ceramic plate slipped from her trembling fingers, shattering on the floorboards. The sound was a gunshot in the quiet room. She stared at the pieces, a symbol of her own fractured piece, and felt a sudden, sharp sting behind her eyes. Before she could move, Cormac was there. He didn't kneel to pick up the pieces. He didn't speak. He simply stood beside her, his presence a solid, grounding force in her sudden spiral. He reached out, his calloused fingers wrapping gently around her wrist. The touch was not practical, not accidental. It was intentional, a current of warmth that shot up her arm and straight to the hollow place in her chest. It was too much. The feeling, the hope, the terrifying possibility of it all. She pulled her hand back as if burned. I'm too old for this, she whispered, the words escaping on a shaky breath. It wasn't just about him, about this moment. It was about the risk of feeling again, the potential for another loss, the ache of a heart being coaxed back to life. She was too old for the pain that came with caring. Cormac's expression didn't change, but his eyes softened. He saw the fear behind her words, the wall she was desperately trying to rebuild. His voice, when he finally spoke, was that same low rumble, rough but inexplicably gentle. Age has nothing to do with it, Abigail, he said, using her name for the first time. It has to do with being alive. He challenged the very foundation of her resignation, suggesting that the fortress she'd built wasn't for protection, but had become her prison. The next day dawned bright and clear, the sky washed clean by the storm. But the peace was deceptive. Around noon, they appeared on the horizon, 3 riders, moving with a purpose that made the hairs on Abigail's arms stand up. They weren't lost travelers or friendly neighbors. They were trouble, wearing it like a second skin. They stopped a few yards from the porch, their horses kicking up dust that settled like a shroud. Cormac had come to stand beside her, his body a rigid line, his face unreadable stone. The man in the lead, a lean figure with cold, dead eyes and a cruel twist to his lips, dismounted. His gaze flickered over Abigail with dismissive appraisal before settling on Cormac. "Well, look what the wind blew in," the man drawled, a smile that was all teeth. "We figured you were dead, Cormac." Or halfway to Mexico. This was Marcus. The past Cormac had spoken of. The man nodded toward Abigail. "Found yourself a nice, quiet place to hide." The words were poison. Marcus turned his chilling smile on her. "This man you've taken in, He's got a history. A bloody one. He rode with us. Left us high and dry after the Black Creek payroll job, with a bullet in my brother and his share of the gold." The mystery was solved, and the truth was a cold knot in Abigail's stomach. Cormac wasn't just a drifter, he was an outlaw, a gunman. The capable hands that had mended her fence had also held a smoking pistol. The quiet man who listened to her grief was a man who had caused it in others. She looked at Cormac, at the stoic mask that had fallen back into place, and saw him through new eyes. Her fear and the fragile, burgeoning feelings for him were at war within her, a silent, brutal battle. Sometimes the past refuses to stay buried, riding back into our lives when we least expect it. If you're enjoying this story of redemption, drop a like to let me know. The air crackled, thick with the promise of violence. Marcus gestured with his chin towards a heavy saddlebag on his horse. "We're not here for you, Cormac. We're here for what's ours. The gold you took. Hand it over, and we ride on." Cormac didn't move. His voice was dangerously low, a growl that vibrated through the porch boards. "There is no gold. I left it." Marcus laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "A man like you doesn't just walk away from a fortune. Now, are you going to give it to us, or are we going to have to tear this place apart to find it? Maybe persuade the lady to tell us where it is." The threat, aimed at her, was the spark in the powder keg. Abigail saw the shift in Cormac's posture, a subtle coiling of muscle, the stillness of a predator. He was making a choice. Not for himself, but for her. The world exploded. A shout. Metal on leather. Cormac moved with a speed that was terrifying, a blur of motion. He wasn't reaching for a gun. He lunged forward, grabbing a heavy piece of firewood from the pile beside the steps. He threw it with pinpoint accuracy, striking the closest rider in the chest and knocking him from his horse. A gun barked. The world became a maelstrom of dust and fury. Cormac used the porch post as cover, drawing the pistol that had been tucked in his belt, a weapon Abigail hadn't even known he carried. One shot. Not a wild spray of bullets. A single, deliberate shot that struck the gun from Marcus's hand, sending it spinning into the dirt. A man screaming in pain. Another scrambling for his horse. Silence. It was over as quickly as it began. Marcus clutched his wounded hand, his face a mask of shock and hatred. Cormac stood, gun still level, the killer he had been and the protector he had become fused into one terrifying, magnificent figure. He had chosen his side. He had chosen how the dust settled, clinging to the sweat on Abigail's skin. The 2 uninjured men helped Marcus onto his horse, and the 3 of them rode away, a slow, defeated retreat, leaving only the echo of their threats hanging in the air. The danger had passed, but the truth remained, stark and unavoidable between them. Cormac stood in the yard, the gun still in his hand, though it was now pointed at the ground. He looked smaller, somehow, stripped of his mystery. He was just a man, his violent past laid bare for her to see. He slowly turned to face her, his expression grim, his stormy eyes filled with a resignation she recognized. It was the look of a man who expected to be told to leave, to be cast out. He didn't wait for her judgment. He began to speak, his voice raw, the words spilling out of him as if a dam had finally broken. He told her everything. About the war that had hollowed him out, about falling in with the wrong men because he didn't know how to be anything else. He told her about the Black Creek job, the moment he saw the fear in a bank teller's eyes and saw the monster he'd become. The gold wasn't stolen, it was his attempt at penance. He'd left it in a church poor box 100 miles away and had been running ever since. Not from the law, or from Marcus, but from himself. He stood before her, offering the ugly, broken pieces of his life. Abigail listened, her heart pounding a slow, steady rhythm. She looked at his scars, the old ones and the new, and she looked at the invisible wounds he carried, the guilt that stooped his shoulders. She saw her own grief, her own solitude, her own scars reflected in him. They were not so different. Two survivors, marked by the world, each seeking a place to heal. She could send him away, back to his ghosts. Or she could do the bravest thing she had done in years. She could choose to see the man standing before her now, not the one he had been. She walked down the porch steps, the old wood groaning under her weight. The space between them shrank until she could feel the heat coming off his skin. He stood perfectly still, a man awaiting a verdict. She raised a hand, her fingers trembling slightly, and gently traced the silvered crescent scar on his face. It was not a gesture of pity, but of acceptance. A silent acknowledgement of the pain he had carried, a sign that she was not afraid of it. His eyes closed for a brief moment, a flicker of profound relief crossing his features. In that quiet cabin, lit by the fading afternoon sun, a new understanding was reached without a single word. Later, in the soft glow of the lamplight, she stood before him. She felt his gaze on her, steady and full of a reverence that made her feel seen for the first time in a decade. "I'm too old for this," she had said. But she was wrong. She was not too old to feel, only too afraid. She reached for the top button of her worn, grey dress, the uniform of her widowhood, the armor she had worn for so long. Her fingers fumbled, and his hands, calloused and strong, came up to cover hers. He didn't take over. He simply stilled there trembling, his thumbs stroking the backs of her hands before he slowly, deliberately, undid the button for her. One by one, the buttons came undone. It was not an act of passion, but of profound vulnerability. It was the shedding of her past, of the woman who survived. It was the quiet, terrifying, and beautiful act of two broken souls choosing to be whole, not alone, but with each other. The lamplight gilded their skin, catching the silver of her hair and the lines on his face, illuminating every flaw, every scar, and making them beautiful. It was a baptism, a quiet promise made in the heart of the wild desert, a final surrender to the hope she had tried so desperately to deny. The next morning, the sunrise painted the horizon in strokes of soft pink and brilliant gold. The air was cool and clean, filled with the scent of damp earth and the promise of a new day. They sat on the porch steps, mugs of hot coffee steaming in their hands, watching the world awaken. The silence between them was no longer a space to be filled but a shared peace, as comfortable and familiar as the worn wood beneath them. The harsh landscape that had once seemed to her a mirror of her own desolation now looked different. It was still wild, still untamed, but it held a stark, breathtaking beauty she hadn't allowed herself to see for years. It was a land of survival, yes, but it was also a land of new beginnings. The thematic question that had haunted her had finally been answered. She was not too old. She had not been too old for trouble, or for fear, or for violence. And she was not too old for this. For peace. For a quiet joy that felt as real and solid as the warm mug in her hands. She turned her head, looking at the man beside her. He was watching the sunrise, but his expression was one of someone who had finally found his own. "Stay," she asked. The word was not a question of desperation, but a simple, confident invitation. He turned to meet her gaze, and a slow smile, the first true smile she had ever seen from him, lit his face from within. It chased away the shadows and the weariness, revealing the man he was meant to be. "I'm home," he said, his voice quiet but sure. And in the vast, quiet expanse of the west, under a sky that stretched on forever, two solitary souls had finally found their fortress, not in walls of wood, but in each other. They found their second chance. If you believe in new beginnings, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that touch the heart.